It happened 3 minutes into Jimmy's set at Monterey. D.A. Pennebaker was filming, his camera capturing every moment for the documentary. Then Jimmy hit a chord, or maybe it wasn't a chord, maybe it was something else entirely, and a sound came out of his guitar that Pennebaker had never heard before. Not loud, not soft, something else. Something that made Pennebaker's hand drop from the camera. His crew looked at him, confused. The greatest documentary filmmaker of his generation had just stopped filming the most important moment of the festival. June 18, 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival was the first major rock festival of its kind, and D.A. Pennebaker was there to document it. At 42 years old, Pennebaker was already a legend in documentary filmmaking. He'd created Don't Look Back, the groundbreaking film about Bob Dylan's 1965 tour. He'd filmed everyone from Joan Baez to Little Richard. He knew how to stay objective, how to keep the camera rolling no matter what happened in front of it. Pennebaker had been briefed about Jimi Hendrix, the British import who was supposedly revolutionizing guitar, the showman who played with his teeth and lit his guitar on fire. Pennebaker wasn't particularly impressed by the description. He'd seen plenty of showmen. Rock and roll was full of gimmicks. His job was to document whatever happened, not to get caught up in the hype. When Jimmy walked onto the Monterey stage wearing a bright red and pink feathered outfit, Pennebaker thought he understood what he was dealing with. A flashy performer, lots of visual spectacle. He positioned himself and his crew to capture the performance, expecting something theatrical but ultimately conventional. The first 2 minutes of the set confirmed his expectations. Jimmy played Killing Floor, and while the guitar work was impressive, it was within the realm of what Pennebaker had heard before. Good technique, lots of energy, crowd getting excited. Pennebaker filmed it all professionally, capturing the angles, the crowd reactions, the band dynamics. Then, 3 minutes in, something changed. Jimmy transitioned into a new song, and he hit what should have been a simple chord, but the sound that came out of his amplifier was unlike anything Pennebaker had ever heard. It wasn't louder than what came before. It wasn't a different note. It was a different quality of sound entirely, like the guitar was speaking in a language that shouldn't exist. Pennebaker's hand dropped from the camera, not intentionally. His body just responded to the sound by stopping what it was doing. The camera kept recording for a few seconds. It was still running on his shoulder, but Pennebaker wasn't operating it anymore. He was just standing there, listening. His assistant, Roger Murphy, noticed immediately. "Boss," he whispered urgently, "you're not filming." Pennebaker didn't respond. He was staring at Jimmy, trying to understand what he was hearing. The sound was coming from a guitar. He could see the guitar. He could see Jimmy's fingers on the fretboard. But the sound that was emerging didn't match the visual input his brain was receiving. It was like watching someone speak English, but hearing Chinese. Murphy physically touched Pennebaker's shoulder. "Are you okay?" "I've never heard that before," Pennebaker said quietly. His eyes never left the stage. "Never heard what?" That sound. I didn't know a guitar could make that sound." Murphy listened more carefully. He heard impressive guitar playing, certainly, lots of feedback and distortion, but nothing that seemed to justify Pennebaker's reaction. "It's just guitar, boss. Can you get back on camera? We're missing the shot." Pennebaker lifted the camera again, but his hands were shaking slightly. Through his headphones, the direct feed from the stage audio, the sound was even more intense. It was like Jimmy had found a frequency that resonated directly with some part of Pennebaker's consciousness that had never been touched before. Over his 20-year career, Pennebaker had developed a professional detachment. You point the camera, you capture the moment, you stay objective. Emotional reactions were for the audience watching the final film, not for the filmmaker during the shoot. But that detachment was crumbling as he listened to Jimmy play. The sound Jimmy was creating wasn't just music, it was architecture made of audio. It had dimension, texture, color.
Pennebaker could almost see it, not literally, but in his mind's eye. The sound had form. It bent and curved through space. It had weight. He'd filmed orchestras, he'd filmed jazz virtuosos, he'd filmed folk singers and rock bands, and everything in between. But this was different. This was a single man with a single instrument, creating sounds that seemed to require an entire ensemble. Pennebaker noticed something else strange. His perception of time had altered. Each note Jimi played seemed to last longer than it should, not because the tempo had slowed. The rhythm section was still driving forward at normal speed, but somehow, within the structure of the song, Jimi was creating pockets of expanded time where individual sounds could unfold and reveal themselves. During a particularly intense section, Pennebaker found himself holding his breath. He'd filmed dramatic moments before, protests, conflicts, intimate confessions, but he'd never had a physical reaction like this to music. His chest felt tight, his skin had goosebumps. The sound was affecting him on a physiological level. Murphy, watching Pennebaker closely now, was getting concerned. The boss looked like he was in some kind of trance. His camera work had become erratic, sometimes perfectly framed, sometimes drifting off focus. This wasn't like the professional, meticulous Pennebaker he knew. Then Jimi did something that made Pennebaker lower the camera again. He created a sound that seemed to be coming from multiple places at once. The logical part of Pennebaker's brain knew it was feedback interacting with the amplifier, creating complex harmonic patterns. But it didn't sound like feedback. It sounded like the air itself was vibrating, like reality had developed a voice and was singing. "I have to understand this," Pennebaker muttered. "What?" Murphy asked. "What he's doing, how he's doing it. This shouldn't be possible with 6 strings and an amplifier." Murphy had worked with Pennebaker long enough to recognize when the boss was on to something significant. Pennebaker had an instinct for moments that mattered, moments that would define an era or capture something essential about the human experience. If Pennebaker was this affected, something genuinely extraordinary was happening.
But Murphy still didn't hear it the same way. To him, it was impressive guitar playing, sure, revolutionary maybe, but not reality-altering. Which made him wonder, was Pennebaker hearing something that Murphy couldn't? Or was Pennebaker so primed to witness history that he was projecting significance onto what was ultimately just very good rock and roll? Pennebaker kept filming, but he was no longer following his usual documentary approach. Normally, he'd capture wide shots of the stage, cut to crowd reactions, get multiple angles to edit together later. Instead, he was fixated on Jimi, just Jimi. The camera barely moved because Pennebaker had realized something. The sound wasn't just coming from the guitar, it was coming from Jimi. His entire body was part of the instrument, the way he moved, the way he bent and swayed, the expressions on his face, all of it was generating the sound somehow. This was something Pennebaker understood about great performers. They didn't just play their instruments, they became conduits for something larger. He'd seen it with Dylan, with Baez, with the best artists he'd documented. But with Jimi, the merger of performer and instrument was so complete that Pennebaker couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. As Jimi built toward what would become the famous guitar-burning finale, the sounds became more extreme, more feedback, more distortion, more noise that shouldn't be musical but somehow was. And through it all, Pennebaker kept his camera trained on Jimi, even as part of his brain was screaming that this was impossible, that what he was hearing couldn't be produced by one person with one guitar. Later, during post-production, Pennebaker would spend hours analyzing the audio from that performance. He'd bring in sound engineers trying to understand the technical aspects of what Jimi had done. They'd explain the feedback loops, the amplifier settings, the innovative use of the whammy bar. But their explanations never quite captured what Pennebaker had experienced in the moment. It's like trying to explain why a sunset is beautiful by breaking down the wavelengths of light, Pennebaker would tell colleagues. The technical explanation is accurate but incomplete.
It doesn't account for the experience. The experience. That's what Pennebaker kept coming back to. He'd been to thousands of concerts, filmed hundreds of performers, but the Monterey performance was the only time he'd been so affected by music that he physically couldn't maintain his professional distance, the only time a sound had reached past his camera and grabbed him directly. After the set ended, after Jimi had destroyed his guitar in flames and walked off stage, Pennebaker sat down on the grass near the stage. His hands were still shaking slightly. Murphy sat down next to him. "That was something," Murphy said. "Yeah," Pennebaker replied. Then, after a long pause, "I dropped the camera. I noticed. I've never done that. In 20 years, I've never stopped filming because I was too overwhelmed to work. Did we get enough footage?"
Pennebaker thought about it. They'd missed maybe 30 seconds total when he'd lowered the camera. 30 seconds during which some of the most extraordinary sounds were happening, sounds that would never be exactly replicated, moments lost forever because Pennebaker had been too stunned to do his job. "We got enough," he said, "but we lost something, something I can't even describe. There were moments when the sound was so, I don't even have words for it, and I wasn't filming." "Will you regret that?" Pennebaker considered the question carefully. "No, because if I'd been focused on the camera, on the framing and the exposure and the technical aspects, I might have missed the experience. Sometimes you have to stop being a documentarian and just be a witness." That night, back at his hotel, Pennebaker couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard. He kept replaying it in his mind, trying to hold on to the memory of that sound. But already it was fading. The specifics of it, the exact quality that had affected him so deeply, was becoming harder to recall with precision. He called his wife from the hotel room. "I witnessed something today," he told her. "I don't know how to explain it. A guitarist made sounds I've never heard before, sounds I didn't think were possible." "Was it good?" she asked. "Good is the wrong word. It was necessary, like it needed to exist, like music had been incomplete before this, and now something had been filled in." She'd been married to Pennebaker long enough to know when he was on to something significant. "Will this be in the documentary?" "It has to be, but I'm afraid the film won't capture it. You had to be there. You had to hear it in person, feel it in your chest. A camera flattens 3 dimensions into 2. I think this sound exists in dimensions we can't record." When Pennebaker edited the Monterey Pop Festival documentary, he made Jimi's performance the climax of the film. He knew, even as he was editing, that the final product wouldn't fully convey what he'd experienced. The audio recording was excellent, high quality for 1967, but it was still just a recording. It couldn't capture the physical sensation of being in that field, feeling the sound move through the air, watching Jimi create something that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Years later, in interviews, Pennebaker would be asked about the Monterey Festival. Invariably, the conversation would turn to Jimi, and Pennebaker would try to explain about the sound, about the moment when he'd lowered his camera, about the experience of hearing something his brain couldn't quite process. "People ask me about the guitar burning," Pennebaker would say, "and yes, that was visually spectacular. But for me, the real moment was earlier, when Jimi played a chord that made me forget I was working, that made me forget everything except what I was hearing. That's never happened to me before or since." Some interviewers would press him. What exactly made it so special? What was the technical innovation? Pennebaker never had a satisfying answer to those questions, because the power of what Jimi did that day wasn't entirely technical. It was something else, something that existed in the space between the musician and the listener, in the moment of transmission when sound becomes experience.
The documentary Monterey Pop became legendary. Jimi's performance in it introduced many people to his genius. But Pennebaker always knew that the film was an imperfect translation of what actually happened. 20 or 30 seconds of the most extraordinary sounds went unfilmed because he'd been too stunned to work. And even what was captured couldn't fully convey the immensity of the experience. But in a way, Pennebaker came to appreciate that incompleteness. It meant that some moments couldn't be replicated or reproduced. They existed only in the memories of those who were present. The sound that made him drop his camera lived on only in his mind and in the minds of the other people in that field who'd heard it and been changed by it. "I'm glad I put the camera down," Pennebaker said in one of his final interviews about Monterey, "because it meant I was fully present for something that can never happen again. Jimi made a sound that day that was unique in the history of music. And for 30 seconds, I wasn't a filmmaker. I was just someone hearing something impossible become real." If this story about the sound that stopped time moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who understands that some experiences transcend documentation. Have you ever heard something so extraordinary you forgot to record it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to turn on notifications for more untold stories about the moments that cameras couldn't quite capture.